Greetings, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Jesus' Problematic Parables. And in this episode, I'll be discussing a parable from part 2 of Herzog's book, the parable of the unjust judge. Now, this is, compared to other parables, it's a relatively obscure one. You don't hear as many sermons as the next parable, which is about the Pharisee and the tax collector. But I chose this parable of the second set of 5 parables in Herzog's book because it illustrates his point, I feel, a lot better than the other parables. So this parable exposes the conflict between the Torah as it exists ideally and the Torah as it functions in practice. It focuses on the importance of the widow as an oppressed woman whose voice breaks the culture of silence in which she is immersed, and forces an accommodation with the Torah as practiced by the judges of unrighteousness and injustice. The parable presents 2 characters and 2 intertwined social systems that bring them together. And it tells us from the outset that this judge neither fears God nor respects human beings. The Greek phrase here indicates a Hebrew understanding of a man of the worst kind, meaning a man who is impervious to moral authority from God, as well as the public opinion of the governed. Basically, this is a man who only responds to money and power. This is precisely a man against the admonishment found in the book of Amos in the Old Testament, who denounced corrupt judges in Israel. And the interpreters see this phrase as more than merely a crooked judge. This is a portrait of a man who is unable to realize he commits evil when he fails to do justice as mandated by the Torah. He is in a position to uphold the Torah, but he subverts it by failing to do so. In the Jewish Mishnah, it stated that it's assumed that every village with a population in excess of 120 people would have a tribunal or a court of 7 judges, and this is the ideal. Now, we don't know whether the setting is a market town, an administrative center, or a city, but regardless of that, the parable raises 2 questions. What is the nature of the case being adjudicated? And second, why is just one judge handling this case? Now, given that the victim is a widow, we can infer that the case revolves around inheritance rights. In Jewish society, a widow was entitled to survive from the resources of her husband's estate unless she chose to return to her father's house, in which case she would forfeit any benefit from the estate. However, if she chose to be maintained by the husband's estate, she was usually reduced to a menial role in that family. If her dead husband had brothers and she would press her right to levirate marriage, she could have increased household tensions, especially if the brother declined, and this is actually an option that was available in Mosaic law. Now, widows in this time were in a very precarious social situation because of the defined gender roles, and they were usually urged to remarry as soon as possible. In Jewish society, the place of the woman was within the household and the village. And a woman became a threat to the social order when she was no longer contained within the bounds of the roles of mother or daughter. The widow in the parable is precisely in this situation. Her husband is dead, and she wants to claim either her maintenance from his estate or to reclaim her ketubah, which is the amount of money her husband would have pledged to her as an inheritance in the event of his death. Now, depending on whether the husband had written a ketubah or not, litigation usually followed. The second question, why was one judge handling the case? Why didn't we have a tribunal of 3 or of 7 as suggested by the Mishnah and Josephus? In Aboth 4, chapter 4, verse 8, Rabbi Ishmael says, quote, "Judge not alone, for none may judge alone save one." Now, the reason for this discrepancy between having one judge as opposed to multiple judges is likely found in the discrepancy between the real and the ideal. Ideally, each town with 120 men would have a court of 7 judges to adjudicate the Torah at the gate. In reality, it was difficult to find enough men learned in the Torah, in the written Torah and the oral Torah, to fulfill that quota. So, on the assumption that it was more important to disperse the rule of the Torah as far as possible, it's better to have one judge than no judges at all. Now, what was the larger role of law, Mosaic law, in agrarian societies? Well, recodifying the law as expressed in the ideal into the real occupied an important step in the operating procedures used by the elites to transform their rule by power into a rule by persuasion. Basically trying to transform the rule of might into the rule of right. Because the laws are stated in general, in personal terms, they appear to support abstract principles of justice rather than special interests of particular groups or classes of people. And the task of the scribes was to recodify laws in a way that seemed to support justice, while actually protecting or expanding the prerogatives of the ruling elites. And this is one reason why Jesus actually singles out lawyers and scribes for vicious condemnation in a very famous diatribe in the Gospels. Now, in other words, the law codes were part of the cover story. The pursuit of justice masked the real story, which was the extension of real power and real control. And gaining control of the law and its interpretation was an important tool in establishing ideological control. In Palestine, the use of the oral Torah to interpret the Torah provided an institutionalized framework for continually recodifying the Torah to protect the special interests, while presenting the process as merely applying the principles of justice found in the written Torah. And this maneuver becomes quite clear when we look at this parable. One implication of this is that the officers of the court were appointed to serve the interests of the rulers and not to dispense impartial justice. And the problem they faced was how to appear as representatives of justice while rendering decisions in favor of the rich and powerful. The only surprising element in this parable is that the judge seems to have abandoned this pretense. Now, the widow was in a vulnerable situation, which is exactly why she was the target for exploitation. This may explain why widows were and orphans were the subject of such concern in the Torah and the prophets. In Exodus, possibly the most famous, very famous passage, God promises to hear the cry of the widow and the orphan, just as he heard the cries of Hebrew slaves in Egypt. The large number of passages throughout the Old Testament on this matter tells us that this was actually an acute problem in Israel. And this is why widow and orphan cases in Judaism were supposed to receive priority in the courts. So here, the widow's plea isn't one of vengeance, but rather one of vindication and survival. In light of this, the parable makes three assumptions. First, that the widow is in the right and is being denied justice. Second, the judge doesn't want to serve her because she has not provided bribes. Third, the judge prefers to favor her adversary because he is either powerful or provided bribes. Now, how do we imply this in the parable? Well, running out of time.